The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as James Wellington adjusted his red tunic for what he believed would be another routine day of guard duty. At 28, James had served as a Queen's guard for 6 years, standing motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and tried to make him smile. He took pride in his unwavering discipline and the centuries-old traditions he upheld. That Tuesday in March 2019 started like any other. James had polished his boots until they gleamed, pressed his uniform to perfection, and carefully positioned his iconic bearskin hat. But there was something different about this particular mornea, a small silver pendant that hung beneath his red tunic. Hidden from view, the pendant had belonged to his great-grandfather, William Wellington, who had served in the same regiment. During World War II, it was a simple piece, no larger than a coin, engraved with the family crest and a Latin phrase that meant honor above all. James's grandmother had given it to him when he joined the Guards, telling him it would bring him luck and keep him safe. Just as it had protected his great-grandfather through the darkest days of the war, as James took his position outside the palace gates, he felt the familiar weight of the pendant against his chest. The metal was warm from his body heat, and somehow its presence made him feel connected to his family's long tradition of military service. Tourists began gathering. Cameras ready, children pointing excitedly at the stoic figure in red. The first sign that this day would be different came around noon. A well-dressed woman in her 50s approached the barrier. But instead of taking pictures like other visitors, she stared intently at James. She seemed to be studying something specific about his uniform, her eyes narrowing as if she had noticed something unusual. James maintained his rigid posture, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded. But from the corner of his eye, he could see the woman pulling out her phone and making what appeared to be a very serious call. Her voice was too quiet to hear over the street noise. Her gestures suggested urgency and concern. After several minutes, the woman ended her call and continued to watch James. She didn't leave like other tourists. Instead, she positioned herself where she could observe him clearly and appeared to be waiting for something or someone. James began to feel uneasy, though he couldn't show it. By mid-afternoon, the woman had been joined by 2 men in expensive suits. They stood at a respectful distance, but kept James under constant observation. One of them was taking notes in a leather portfolio, while the other seemed to be photographing not James himself, but specific details of his uniform and equipment. The situation became even more peculiar when a black sedan pulled up near the palace gates. 3 more individuals emerged, including someone who appeared to be a lawyer based on the briefcase and formal attire. They joined the growing group of observers, all of whom seemed intensely interested in James specifically. It's not the palace or the changing of the guard ceremony, as his shift neared its end. James noticed palace security had begun to take notice of the unusual attention he was receiving. 2 plainclothes officers were now monitoring the group of observers, speaking quietly into their radios. The atmosphere had shifted from tourist curiosity to something that felt much more serious and official. When James was finally relieved of his post at 4 p.m., his commanding officer, Captain Morrison, was waiting for him instead of simply allowing him to return to the barracks as usual. The captain's expression was unreadable, but there was a tension in his bearing that James had rarely seen. "Wellington," Captain Morrison said quietly, "I need you to come with me. There are some people who need to speak with you about something they believe you're wearing." James's hand instinctively moved toward his chest, where the pendant lay hidden beneath his uniform. His heart began to race as he realized that somehow, impossibly, these strangers had detected the presence of his great-grandfather's pendant. But how could they have known about it? And more importantly, why did they care about a simple family heirloom? As they walked toward the administrative offices, James caught sight of the group of observers being escorted through a side entrance. Whatever was happening, it was clear that his ordinary day of guard duty had become something extraordinary, potentially troubling. The pendant that had brought his family comfort and protection for over 70 years was about to thrust James Wellington into a legal battle that would challenge everything he thought he knew about ownership, history, and justice. The conference room in the palace administrative wing felt smaller than it actually was, filled with tension and the weight of unspoken accusations. James sat rigidly in his chair, still wearing his guard uniform, as 6 strangers arranged themselves. Around the polished oak table, Captain Morrison had introduced them briefly to lawyers, a woman who claimed to represent a Jewish family organization, a historian, and 2 individuals whose roles remained mysteriously undefined. The woman who had first spotted James outside the gates was named Sarah Goldstein, and she served as a liaison for families seeking to recover artwork and artifacts looted during the Holocaust. Her voice was steady, but carried an unmistakable edge of authority as she began to explain why they were all gathered in this room. "Mr. Wellington," she said, opening a thick folder filled with documents and photographs, "we have reason to believe that the pendant you're wearing beneath, your uniform, was stolen from my client's family in Vienna in 1943. James felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath him. The pendant, his great-grandfather's pendant, stolen? It seemed impossible. His family had treasured it for generations. Passing down the story of how it had protected William Wellington through the war, Sarah continued, sliding a black-and-white photograph across the table. It showed a distinguished elderly man in formal dress, wearing what appeared to be the exact same pendant that now hung around James's neck. This is Heinrich Rosenberg, photographed at a charity gala in Vienna in 1942. The pendant was a family heirloom, crafted in the 18th century and passed down through 7 generations. One of the lawyers, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, pulled out additional documents, according to Nazi records that were discovered in archives in Berlin in 1995. Heinrich Rosenberg's personal effects, including this pendant, were confiscated. When the family was forced from their home in March 1943, the entire family was subsequently transported to concentration camps. James's mouth went dry. He looked at the photograph more carefully, and his heart sank as he recognized every detail of the pendant in the image. The engraving, the size, even a small scratch near the bottom edge, everything matched perfectly. "This is impossible," James managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. "My great-grandfather served with honor. He would never have stolen anything, especially not from victims of the Holocaust." The historian, an older woman with kind eyes, leaned forward sympathetically. "Mr. Wellington, we're not suggesting your great-grandfather was a thief. In the chaos of war, many stolen items ended up in the hands of well-meaning soldiers who had no idea of their true origins. Items were traded, sold, or given as gifts, without anyone knowing their history." Sarah opened another folder and extracted what appeared to be a military record. "We've researched your great-grandfather's service record. William Wellington was, indeed, an honorable soldier. In late 1943, his unit was involved in liberating several areas where Nazi loot was being stored. It's entirely possible that he acquired the pendant believing it to be legitimately available, perhaps from another soldier or a displaced person who needed to trade it for food or safe passage." The weight of this information settled heavily on James's shoulders. His great-grandfather's heroic image remained intact, but the beloved family heirloom, the symbol of their military legacy, had a dark and tragic history he had never imagined. Captain Morrison had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. "What exactly are you asking of us?" The second lawyer, a woman with a crisp British accent, answered, "The Rosenberg family has been searching for this pendant for over 70 years. Heinrich's great-niece, now in her 80s and living in New York, is the sole surviving member of the family. She has been working with restitution organizations to recover her family's stolen heritage." "The pendant represents more than monetary value," Sarah added. "It's one of the few remaining connections to a family that was almost entirely destroyed. Heinrich's great-niece has memories of her great-uncle showing her the pendant when she was a small child before the war tore their world apart." James felt sick to his stomach. The pendant that had been a source of comfort and connection to his own family history was simultaneously a symbol of unimaginable loss for another family. The irony was devastating. While it had represented protection and survival to the Wellingtons, it also represented the destruction of the Rosenbergs. "What happens now?" James asked quietly. The thin lawyer straightened his papers. "Legally, This is a clear case of stolen property. Even though your family possessed it in good faith for decades, the original theft was never resolved. Under both British law and international agreements regarding Holocaust restitution, the pendant should be returned to its rightful owners. However, the British lawyer added, "We understand the emotional significance this item holds for your family as well. The organization I represent is prepared to work with you to find a solution that honors both families' connections to this piece." James looked around the room, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. How could something so simple or pendant worn out of family pride and tradition have become the center of such a significant legal and moral dilemma? The meeting concluded with James being given 48 hours to consider his options and consult with his own legal representation. As he left the conference room, the pendant felt heavier against his chest than it ever had before. Weighted now, not just with his family's history, but with the ghost of another family's tragedy. The small legal office in central London felt worlds away from the grandeur of Buckingham Palace as James sat across from solicitor Margaret Hayes, who specialized in art restitution and wartime recovery cases. The 48 hours he'd been given to consider his options had passed in a blur of sleepless nights and difficult conversations with his family. His grandmother, now 84 and living in a care home in Yorkshire, had broken down in tears when James called to explain the situation. "That pendant was all I had left of your great-grandfather," she had whispered over the phone. "He wore it through D-Day, through the liberation of the camps. How can they say it doesn't belong to us?" Margaret Hayes spread several legal documents across her desk, her expression serious but compassionate. "James, I need you to understand the legal reality we're facing. Under the 1998 Washington Principles on Nazi-confiscated art and subsequent British legislation, there's a strong presumption in favor of returning looted items to their original owners or their heirs." "But my family had no knowledge that it was stolen," James protested. "We've owned it in good faith for over 70 years. Good faith possession is certainly a factor," Margaret acknowledged. "But it doesn't automatically override the rights of the original owners, especially in cases involving Holocaust-eluded property. The courts have consistently ruled that the unique circumstances of Nazi theft require special consideration." She pulled out a case file from her cabinet. "There's a precedent that might interest you, the case of the Klimt paintings that were returned to Maria Altmann in 2006. The Austrian government had possessed those paintings for decades, displaying them in their national gallery. But the courts ultimately ruled that prior theft trumped subsequent good faith ownership." James felt his hopes sinking. "So there's no chance we can keep the pendant?" Margaret held up a hand. "Not necessarily. Oh, there are several factors that could work in your favor. First, your great-grandfather's military service and the circumstances under which he likely acquired the pendant showed no intent to commit a crime. Second, your family has maintained and preserved the pendant for 7 decades, which has ensured its survival." She opened another file. "I've been researching the Rosenberg family's history. Heinrich Rosenberg was a prominent jeweler in Vienna before the war. The pendant was actually created by his own father in 1887 as a wedding gift for Heinrich's mother. The Latin inscription, 'Honor above all,' was the family motto. The irony wasn't lost on James. The same motto that had inspired his family's military service had originally belonged to a family that valued honor in their business dealings and community service. Heinrich Rosenberg had been known for his charitable work and had helped many Jewish families emigrate before the situation in Austria became impossible." "What about the monetary value?" James asked. "That's where things become interesting," Margaret replied. "The pendant has been appraised at approximately £30,000, considering its age, craftsmanship, and historical significance. However, the Rosenberg family's attorney has indicated they're more interested in the sentimental value than financial compensation." She leaned back in her chair. "I've been in contact with Sarah Goldstein and the family's legal team. Proposed something unusually shared custody arrangement." James looked puzzled. "Shared custody of a pendant? It's not unheard of in restitution cases," Margaret explained. "The Rosenberg family acknowledges that your family has also formed a deep emotional connection to the pendant. They're proposing that the pendant be officially returned to the Rosenberg heir, but that it be placed on permanent display in the Imperial War Museum, with plaques telling both families' stories. The proposal was more generous than James had expected, but it still felt like losing a piece of his family's soul. What about the legal precedent this might set? Could other families claim items that British soldiers brought home from the war? Margaret nodded gravely. That's exactly why this case is attracting so much attention. Legal scholars are watching closely because it could establish new standards for how Holocaust restitution cases are handled in the UK. If the courts rule strongly in favor of the Rosenberg family, it could open the door for hundreds, or even thousands of similar claims. She showed James newspaper clippings from the past week. The story had begun appearing in major newspapers, with headlines like Royal Guards, Pendant Sparks, Holocaust Restitution Debate, and Family Heirloom Becomes Legal Test Case. The media attention is both good and bad for your case, Margaret continued. Public sympathy tends to favor Holocaust survivors and their families. But there's also growing concern about the broader implications for families who inherited items in good faith. James picked up one of the newspaper articles and read about Ruth Rosenberg Klein, Heinrich's great-niece, who is now 83 and living in a retirement home in Manhattan. The article included a quote from her. "This pendant is the last physical connection I have to my great-uncle, who is like a grandfather to me. But I also understand that another family has treasured it and kept it safe. Perhaps there's a way for both families to honor its memory." "She sounds reasonable," James observed. She is," Margaret agreed. But the legal organizations backing her case are less focused on compromise. They see this as an opportunity to establish strong precedent for future restitution claims. Want a clear victory that sends a message to other families who might be unknowingly possessing Holocaust-eluded items? As the meeting concluded, Margaret handed James a thick folder. "These are all the relevant case studies and legal precedents. You have 1 week to decide how you want to proceed. We can fight this in court, which could take years and cost tens of thousands of pounds, or we can try to negotiate a settlement that acknowledges both families' legitimate interests." Walking out of the legal office and into the busy London street, James felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The pendant beneath his uniform had become a symbol of something much larger than his family's military tradition. It had become a touchstone for questions about justice, ownership, and how societies deal with the lingering effects of historical atrocities. The courtroom at the Royal Courts of Justice on the Strand was packed with reporters, legal observers, and representatives from various Holocaust restitution organizations. What had begun as a simple family matter had evolved into a landmark case that legal scholars were calling Wellington v. Rosenberg Klein. Though both families had tried to keep their dispute out of public court proceedings, the case had escalated when negotiations between the families broke down over the museum display proposal. James's grandmother had been hospitalized after suffering a minor stroke, which the family attributed to the stress of potentially losing the pendant. Meanwhile, Ruth Rosenberg Klein had flown to London, determined to see the pendant that connected her to her lost family. Judge Patricia Thornfield, known for her expertise in international law and cultural property disputes, had agreed to hear the case as a matter of public interest. The legal questions involved had implications far beyond one family's pendant. They touched on fundamental issues of wartime recovery, good faith ownership, and the ongoing responsibilities of nations to address historical injustices. James sat in the front row behind his legal team, wearing his civilian clothes, but carrying himself with the same rigid posture he maintained during guard duty. Across the aisle, Ruth Rosenberg Klein sat with her daughter and legal representatives. She was smaller and more fragile than James had expected, but her eyes held a sharp intelligence and unmistakable determination. The prosecution, representing the Rosenberg family, opened with a powerful presentation about Heinrich Rosenberg's life and the systematic theft carried out by Nazi forces. They displayed photographs of Heinrich's jewelry shop in Vienna, his family portraits from before the war, and Nazi documentation of confiscated items, including the pendant. "Your Honor," the lead attorney stated, "this is not merely about one pendant. It's about justice for victims of one of history's greatest crimes. When personal property was stolen as part of a genocidal campaign, the passage of time cannot legitimize that theft, regardless of the good intentions of subsequent owners. They presented expert testimony from historians who had studied Nazi looting operations, demonstrating how stolen items had been distributed through various channels, often ending up in the hands of Allied soldiers who had no knowledge of their origins. James's defense team countered with evidence of his great-grandfather's exemplary military service and the family's 70-year stewardship of the pendant. They argued that William Wellington had likely acquired the pendant through legitimate wartime trading or as payment for helping displaced persons. Your Honor, Margaret Hayes argued, while we acknowledge the tragic history of the Rosenberg family, we cannot ignore the legitimate rights of the Wellington family. They have possessed this pendant openly and in good faith for nearly 8 decades. They have preserved it, treasured it, and built their own family traditions around it. The defense presented testimony from military historians who explained how chaotic conditions during and after the war had led to widespread trading of personal items. Soldiers often helped refugees by accepting family heirlooms in exchange for food, safe passage, or protection. There was no evidence that William Wellington had participated in any systematic looting. The most dramatic moment came when Judge Thornfield requested that the pendant be brought to court for examination. James slowly removed the chain from around his neck and handed it to the court officer. As it was passed to Ruth Rosenberg line for identification, the elderly woman began to weep. "That's it," she whispered, loud enough for the microphone to pick up. "I remember the scratch near the bottom. My great-uncle showed me how it happened when he dropped it as a child. I haven't seen it since I was 7 years old." Her emotional response resonated throughout the courtroom. But James's legal team quickly pointed out that the pendant had also been examined by the Wellington family for 70 years. Any identifying features could have been noted and documented during that time. Expert gemologists and historians testified about the pendant's craftsmanship and materials, confirming that it had indeed been created in Vienna in the 1880s by the techniques typical of Heinrich Rosenberg's father's workshop. However, they also noted that the pendant showed signs of careful maintenance and preservation throughout the decades it had been in the Wellington family's possession. The case took an unexpected turn when James's grandmother, despite her recent health problems, insisted on testifying via video link from her hospital bed. Her testimony was both heartbreaking and powerful as she described how the pendant had been her only connection to her deceased husband and the only tangible reminder of his wartime service. That pendant saw him through the darkest days of the war, she said, her voice weak but determined. It was with him when he helped liberate the concentration camps, when he saw the horrors that were done to people like the Rosenberg family. If he had known it belonged to one of the victims, he would have moved heaven and earth to return it. The prosecution then called Ruth Rosenberg Klein to the stand. Her testimony was equally moving as she described her childhood, memories of her great-uncle, and how the pendant represented her family's lost heritage. "I'm not a vengeful person," she said quietly. "I understand that the Wellington family also loves this pendant and has cared for it. But it was stolen from us during the worst time in our history. It's the only thing I have left that my great-uncle touched, that connects me to the family that was murdered." Judge Thornfield adjourned the proceedings for a week to consider the evidence and review legal precedents from similar cases in other countries. The packed courtroom slowly emptied, but James and Ruth found themselves face to face in the hallway outside. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, to people whose families had been connected by tragedy and chance across more than 7 decades. Ruth reached out and briefly touched James's hand. "I hope you know this isn't about hurting your family," she said softly. "It's about remembering mine." James nodded, unable to speak. The pendant that had once symbolized his family's honor and service had become a bridge between 2 stories of loss, survival, and the complex legacy of one of history's darkest chapters. The week between the conclusion of testimony and Judge Thornfield's ruling felt like the longest of James's life. Media coverage of the case had exploded internationally, with news outlets from New York to Berlin covering what had become known as the Pendant case. Legal experts appeared on television programs debating the broader implications, while opinion polls showed the public almost evenly divided on what the right outcome should be. James, had been granted temporary leave from his guard duties as the media attention made it impossible for him to perform his role normally. Photographers and journalists had been camping outside Buckingham Palace, hoping to catch sight of the guard whose family heirloom had sparked an international legal debate. During this period, something unexpected happened. James received a letter forwarded through his solicitor's office. It was from Ruth Rosenberg Klein, written in careful handwriting on hotel stationery. "Dear James," it began, "I hope you don't mind that I'm writing to you directly. I've been thinking about our families and this pendant that has somehow brought us together across so many years. I wanted you to know that I've been learning about your great-grandfather's service, and I believe he was truly a hero. If circumstances had been different, I think my great-uncle Heinrich would have admired him greatly." The letter continued, for several pages sharing details about Heinrich Rosenberg's life that hadn't come up during the court proceedings. He had been a master craftsman who had created jewelry not just for wealthy clients, but had often worked for free to make wedding rings and religious items for poor families in Vienna's Jewish community. He had also secretly helped finance the escape of several families before the Nazi occupation made such activities impossible. I keep thinking about how strange it is that this pendant, which represented honor and service to my family, somehow found its way to another family that values those same principles," Ruth had written. "Perhaps there's a reason beyond chance that it has been preserved by your family all these years." The letter concluded with an unexpected proposal. Ruth suggested that regardless of the court's decision, both families should work together to ensure that the full story of the pendant, both the Rosenberg family's tragedy and the Wellington family's stewardship, should be preserved and shared. Meanwhile, James's family was dealing with their own internal struggles. His grandmother's health had stabilized, but she remained adamant that losing the pendant would be like losing her husband all over again. James's parents were torn between respecting her feelings and acknowledging the legitimate claims of the Rosenberg family. The broader legal community was watching the case closely because Judge Thornfield's ruling would likely establish new precedent for similar disputes. Law schools were studying the case, and several international organizations had filed friend-of-the-court briefs outlining their positions on Holocaust restitution law. 3 days before the scheduled ruling, James made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own legal team. He requested a private meeting with Ruth Rosenberg Klein, without lawyers present. They met in the quiet lounge of Ruth's hotel near Russell Square. Ruth appeared smaller and more tired than she had in court, but her eyes still held the same sharp intelligence James had noticed during her testimony. "I've been thinking about what you wrote in your letter," James began, "about how both our families valued honor and service. I keep wondering what my great-grandfather would want me to do if he knew the truth about the pendant's history." Ruth listened carefully as James struggled with his words. "He spent part of the war helping to liberate concentration camps. Saw what had been done to families like yours. I think he would be horrified to know that he had been carrying something that had been stolen from Holocaust victims." "But your family has also been honorable guardians of this pendant," Ruth replied. "You've preserved it, treasured it, kept it safe when it might otherwise have been lost forever." They talked for over 2 hours, sharing stories about their families, their memories of elderly relatives who had shaped their understanding of history and responsibility. By the end of their conversation, it reached an understanding that neither of their legal teams had been able to achieve. 2 days later, on the morning that Judge Thornfield was scheduled to announce her ruling, both legal teams received an unusual joint statement from James and Ruth. They had reached their own agreement and were requesting that the court endorse their private settlement rather than issuing a ruling that might create unwanted legal precedent. The packed courtroom buzzed with speculation as Judge Thornfield took her seat. She looked somewhat surprised as she reviewed the joint statement that had been filed just hours before the scheduled session. "Before I announce my intended ruling," Judge Thornfield began, "understand that the parties have reached their own agreement. This is unusual, but not unprecedented in cultural property disputes. Mr. Wellington and Mrs. Rosenberg Klein, please approach the bench." James and Ruth walked forward together, carrying a folder containing their handwritten agreement. As they handed it to the judge, Ruth quietly removed something from her purse's small velvet pouch that contained the pendant. James had returned it to her the previous evening as part of their private agreement. "Your Honor," James said, his voice steady, despite his nervousness, "we believe we've found a solution that honors both of our families and serves the interests of justice and historical truth." The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Thornfield reviewed their proposal. After several minutes, she looked up with an expression that seemed both surprised and impressed. "This is indeed an unusual resolution," she said, "but it appears that the parties have crafted something that addresses not only their personal needs, but also the broader questions that this case has raised about historical responsibility and cultural preservation." She turned to address the packed courtroom. "Rather than issue a ruling that might create rigid precedent for future cases, I am prepared to endorse this agreement, provided both parties confirm their consent on the record." Both James and Ruth confirmed their agreement, and Judge Thornfield officially approved their settlement. As they left the courtroom together, reporters shouted questions about the terms of their agreement, but neither James nor Ruth would provide details beyond saying that they had found a way to honor both families. Connections to the pendant, the legal earthquake that everyone had expected from the court's ruling, had been replaced by something perhaps more powerful: two families choosing reconciliation over conflict and finding a creative solution that no court could have imposed. 6 months after the court case that had captured international attention, James Wellington stood in a place he had never expected to visit: the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He wore his dress uniform not as a Queen's Guard, but as an honored guest representing his family at a ceremony that would have been impossible to imagine when this journey began. The agreement that James and Ruth had reached was more innovative than anyone had initially understood. Rather than simply returning the pendant to Ruth or keeping it in James's family, they had created something entirely newer: traveling memorial that would tell the story of both families while educating people about the complex legacy of Holocaust restitution. The pendant now spent part of each year at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, part of the year at the Imperial War Museum in London, and part of the year at the Jewish Museum in Vienna, where Heinrich Rosenberg had once been a prominent member of the community. Each location displayed not just the pendant, but the complete story of both families, with photographs, documents, and personal testimonies from both James and Ruth. But the most remarkable aspect of their agreement was that James and Ruth had become unlikely partners in Holocaust education. They traveled together to schools, universities, and community centers, telling the story of how a simple family heirloom had connected to families across decades and continents. "When we first met in that courtroom," Ruth often said during their presentations, "we saw each other as opponents fighting over the same treasure. What we discovered was that we were actually partners in preserving an important piece of history." James had initially been nervous about public speaking, but he had found his voice telling the story of how his family's military tradition had intersected with one of history's great tragedies. "My great-grandfather believed he was serving honor. By wearing that pendant," he would explain to audiences, "what we learned is that honor sometimes requires us to acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the past." The case had indeed created the legal earthquake that experts had predicted, but not in the way anyone expected. Rather than establishing rigid precedent through a court ruling, the Wellington-Rosenberg Agreement had inspired dozens of families to reach similar private settlements and restitution cases. The collaborative approach had proven more effective than adversarial litigation in resolving complex cultural property disputes. Legal scholars now studied their agreement as an example of restorative justice, an approach that focused on healing and education rather than punishment or simple property transfer. Law schools used their case to teach students about creative problem solving and the importance of understanding the human stories behind legal disputes. The pendant itself had become more than just a family heirloom or a recovered artifact. It had transformed into a teaching tool that helped people understand how individual objects can carry multiple histories and meanings. Museum visitors learned not just about Nazi looting and Holocaust restitution, but about the complexity of wartime experiences and the ongoing responsibilities of subsequent generations. James had returned to his duties as a Queen's Guard, but his role had expanded in unexpected ways. The British Army had asked him to participate in educational programs about military history and cultural sensitivity. Young soldiers learned from James's experience about the importance of understanding the full context of historical events and the items they might encounter during service. Ruth, despite her advanced age, had found new purpose in their joint mission. She had begun writing a book about her family's history, with James contributing a chapter about his great-grandfather's military service and their family's connection to the Pendant. The book was scheduled to be published by Cambridge University Press as part of a series on Holocaust memory and reconciliation. On this particular day in Washington, they were unveiling a new permanent exhibit about wartime displacement and recovery. The pendant was displayed in a specially designed case that allowed visitors to see both sides, along with detailed explanations of the Rosenberg family's craftsmanship traditions and the Wellington family's military heritage. As James and Ruth stood together before the exhibit, a young visitor approached them. She was about 10 years old, visiting with her school class, and she had been studying the display intently. "Excuse me," she said politely, "but I don't understand. If the pendant belonged to the Jewish family first, why isn't the soldier's family sad about giving it back?" Ruth smiled and knelt down to the girl's eye level. "That's a very good question. Truth is, we were both sad about the pendant for many years. But then we realized that sometimes the best way to honor something precious is to share its story with as many people as possible." James added, "My family got to keep the pendant safe for 70 years, even though we didn't know its full history. Now Ruth's family has it back, but they're sharing it with the whole world, in a way that makes it more valuable than it ever was when it was hidden away." The girl nodded thoughtfully and returned to her class, but her question had captured something important about what James and Ruth had accomplished. They had transformed a story of loss and conflict into one of understanding and collaboration. As the ceremony concluded, James and Ruth stood together, looking at the pendant in its new display case. The Latin inscription, "Honor above all," was clearly visible, along with explanations in multiple languages about what that phrase had meant to both families. "Do you ever regret not keeping it?" James asked Ruth quietly as the crowd began to disperse. Ruth considered his question carefully, her fingers tracing patterns in the air as if she were still holding the pendant. "I think about that sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remembered that for 70 years, I thought it was lost forever. Ow! Because of what we've done together, it will never be lost again. Ow! Thousands of people will see it and learn from it. Every year," she paused, watching a group of teenagers examining the display and reading about both families' histories. "Besides, keeping it locked away in my apartment in New York wouldn't have brought back my great-uncle or the rest of my family. But this sharing the story, it's educating people about what happened, this might help prevent such tragedies from happening again." James nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The pendant had taught both of their families that true honor sometimes required letting go of personal attachments in service of a greater purpose. As they prepared to leave the museum, Ruth handed James a small wrapped package. Inside was a photographer copy of the original picture of Heinrich Rosenberg wearing the pendant, but this one had been specially printed and framed. On the back, Ruth had written, "For the Wellington family, who kept Heinrich's pendant safe until it could come home. With gratitude and friendship, Ruth, I want your family to have this," she said. "Your great-grandfather may not have known Heinrich, but they were connected by their belief in honor and service. I think Heinrich would have been proud to know that a soldier like William Wellington carried his pendant through the war." 6 months later, James received news that Ruth had passed away peacefully in her sleep. She had lived long enough to see their book published and to know that their joint legacy would continue through the educational programs they had established. Her family contacted James to let him know that Ruth had left specific instructions for her memorial service she wanted James to speak about their partnership and to wear his full dress uniform as a tribute to his great-grandfather's service, standing at Ruth's memorial service in a synagogue in Manhattan. James realized that the Pendant case had given both of their families something more valuable than they had lost. They had gained a deeper understanding of history, commitment to education and reconciliation, and an unlikely but genuine friendship that had transcended the divisions of the past. The Pendant continued its travels between museums. But its most important journey was complete. It had traveled from a symbol of loss to a symbol of recovery, from a source of conflict to a bridge between families, and from a hidden family heirloom to a public testament to the possibility of healing historical wounds through understanding and cooperation. Years later, when legal scholars wrote about the Wellington v. Rosenberg-Klein case, they noted that it had indeed caused a legal earthquake not through a precedent-setting court ruling, but through demonstrating that even the most complex historical injustices could be addressed through creativity, empathy, and the recognition that some treasures become more valuable when they are shared rather than possessed. The Pendant's inscription, "Honor above all," had proven true for both families, but in ways that neither Heinrich Rosenberg nor William Wellington could have imagined when they first carried it so many decades ago. Asterisk.